Welcome, everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into Jainism. We've got some really interesting excerpts from academic texts here.
Yeah.
And you know me, I love it when my assumptions get challenged. So let's unpack some of the core concepts and history of Jainism. I have a feeling we're in for some surprises.
I think you're right. Jainism is often kind of simplified, boiled down to just the extreme asceticism, but it's so much more than that.
Right.
It's living religion practiced by real people, and their experiences are diverse and really important to understand. It's not a monolith.
I was struck by this idea of Jain identity being kind of fluid. The texts mention these early census records, where some Jains in India actually identified as Jain Hindus.
Oh, wow.
It really makes you wonder how these individuals saw themselves within both of those belief systems.
It's a great example of how religious boundaries, especially in a place like India, they aren't always so clear-cut. And legally, the relationship between Jainism and Hinduism has been really interesting, kind of a back and forth. Sometimes Jains were legally classified as a Hindu sect, depending on how the origins of Jainism were interpreted at the time.
Wow.
And sometimes as a totally distinct religion. So this shifting legal landscape definitely makes this question of identity even more complex.
Definitely not just checking a box.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about Ford makers, those revered teachers in Jainism. The sources we have focus on Mahavira.
Right.
And I'll admit, I always thought he founded Jainism.
Yeah, that's a common misunderstanding. Jains don't see Mahavira as the founder, but as part of this continuous lineage of Ford makers, each one building on the teachings of those who came before. They believe that the core truths of Jainism have always existed, and these Ford makers are the ones who reveal these truths to the world. One detail I find really interesting is how they describe Mahavira's birth. It's unusual, and it almost seems intentionally placed alongside the birth stories of figures like Buddha and Jesus.
Oh, interesting.
Who, also had extraordinary births.
It makes you think about the significance of those narratives, right? Highlighting their destined roles from the very beginning.
Absolutely.
Okay, now on to the Jain sects. The Digambaras and the Svetambaras.
Okay.
Now, on the surface, the big difference seems to be clothing, or the lack of it.
Right.
The Digambaras practice nudity, while the Svetambaras wear those white robes. But I'm guessing there's a lot more to it than fashion choices.
Oh, absolutely. The names themselves tell us a lot. Digambara means sky-clad.
Wow.
And Svetambara means white-clad. Each sect has a different origin story to explain this, and, these stories actually reveal a lot about their philosophies, and even a little rivalry, I think.
Oh, interesting.
The Digambars believe that after Mahavira died, a group of monks led by Padrabahu, they stayed true to that original practice of nudity. And they say that these Svetambaras, those who stayed behind, basically took the easy way out by wearing clothes.
Oh, so the Digambaras see themselves as the purists, preserving the original way.
Exactly. But the Svetambaras, they have their own version. They believe that a monk named Shivaputi, he tried to bring back this stricter, nudity-based Jainism, but they say that practice had died out naturally long before.
Okay.
So to them, Shivaputi was kind of a radical.
Interesting.
And they think the Digambaras are clinging to this extreme practice.
So they're both using their origin stories to kind of undermine each other.
Right.
That's fascinating.
Isn't it?
There's one more detail that really stuck out to me. That Digambara belief that women can achieve enlightenment in their current bodies.
Yes, this is a big point of contention between the two sects.
Yeah.
And it really gets to the heart of how they interpret Jain doctrine.
So why do the Digambaras believe this?
Well, they believe that because women have female bodies and because they wear clothing, they're inherently incapable of reaching that highest spiritual state.
Wow.
They believe women have to be reborn as men to attain liberation. And this is really rooted in their understanding of enlightenment, which emphasizes complete detachment, including detachment from the body.
That's a really stark view.
Yeah.
How do the Svetambaras respond?
They completely reject it. They say women are just as capable as men of achieving liberation.
Okay.
And they point to examples of female Ford makers throughout Jain history.
Interesting. So, two very different takes on that.
Huh.
But both sects have nuns, right?
Yes, they do.
That does raise some questions, doesn't it?
It does.
What are the lives of these nuns like, especially in the Digambara sect, where, they believe they can't achieve enlightenment as women?
It really highlights the complex relationship between doctrine and lived experience.
Right.
Even though Digambar nuns might accept that they can't reach enlightenment as women, they still lead incredibly disciplined and devout lives.
Right.
And their dedication to their practice is so clear. And while Svetambara nuns may not face those same doctrinal barriers, they still deal with societal expectations and practical challenges.
It's a good reminder that there are so many layers to these beliefs.
Absolutely.
And it's not always black and white. Okay, let's talk about Jain scriptures.
Okay.
I'm guessing there isn't one central book, like in some other religions.
You're right. It's much more complex. The Svetambara sect has their canon.
Right.
And there was this event called a Council of Vallabhi, which supposedly took place in the 5th century CE, and it said that the Svetambara canon was finalized there, but there's no actual record of which texts were included at the time.
Wait, so how do they even know what's in the canon?
It's based on tradition and later commentaries, but the idea of this fixed canon from way back then is questionable. It definitely seems to have evolved over time.
That changes things. It challenges this whole idea of a static religious text.
Yeah.
So if the Svetambaras have this kind of fluid canon, what about the Digambaras? What do they consider scripture?
The Digambaras actually reject the Svetambara canon completely.
Really?
They believe that the original scriptures, the most authentic ones, were lost a long time ago during this period of decline for the Jain community.
Wow. So what do they rely on if they don't have the original texts?
They see scripture almost as a metaphor.
Interesting.
You know, representing eternal truths that you can only access through spiritual practice and direct realization.
That's a fascinating perspective.
Isn't it?
It puts the emphasis on personal experience rather than just relying on the text. It really makes you rethink the role of scripture.
Yeah.
These different views on identity, forward makers, and scripture just show how dynamic and complex Jainism really is.
Absolutely. And these differences are going to keep coming up as we explore Jain doctrines.
Well, I'm ready to dive into those. Lead the way.
All right. Okay, so let's dig into some of the core ideas of Jain philosophy. A few key concepts to grasp, starting with jiva, meaning soul.
Okay.
Jains believe that every living being, no matter how tiny, has a jiva. And each jiva is eternally unique and independent.
So everything that's alive has this individual spark, this soul.
Exactly. And then there's a jiva, which is everything that's not soul.
Correct.
Matter, space, time, the principles of motion and rest. Basically, the entire material world.
So a fundamental division between the spiritual, the jiva, and the material.
And these two realms interact through karma. Now, karma in Jainism isn't some cosmic judgment system, like you might think.
Right.
It's actually seen as this subtle matter that attaches to the soul because of our actions.
Okay.
Both physical and mental actions. The type of karma we build up that determines our future rebirths and the experiences we have in those lives.
That's a different way of thinking about karma than what I'm used to.
It is.
So if karma is this matter clinging to the soul, what's the ultimate goal?
The goal is to liberate the soul from this whole cycle of karma and rebirth.
Okay.
And that brings us to the Loka, the Jain universe. It's this vast but finite space. It's shaped like a giant human form, actually, and all souls are going through this cycle of transmigration within it.
Wow.
At the very top of this Loka is a realm called Siddhashila.
Okay.
And that's where liberated souls exist in eternal bliss, totally free from karma and rebirth.
So this idea of constantly striving upwards on this journey towards liberation.
Yes.
You mentioned Jains seeing the soul and body as separate, and that made me think of those kind of disturbing experiments by King Prasenajit.
Oh, right. Those were pretty unsettling.
They were.
King Prasenajit was a skeptic.
Okay.
And he wanted proof of the soul. So he did these experiments on criminals.
You like suffocating them?
Yeah, he suffocated them, weighed them before and after death, even dissected bodies.
What a gruesome way to try to prove a point.
It was. According to Jain accounts, though, he didn't find any physical evidence that the soul exists apart from the body.
So did those experiments settle anything?
Well, for Jains, this lack of physical evidence doesn't mean the soul doesn't exist. It just means that science can't always be applied to spiritual matters.
Like trying to measure love with a ruler.
Exactly. Some things are just beyond those kinds of instruments.
So we've got jiva, ajiva, karma, loka.
Yeah.
Anything else about these fundamental ideas of Jainism?
Yes, one more important concept. The 9 reals, or tattvas.
Okay.
Think of these as a roadmap for the soul's spiritual transformation.
Got it.
They include the 5 categories we already talked about. Jiva, ajiva, space, motion, and rest. Plus 4 more. the influx of karma, the bondage of karma, the stoppage of karma, and finally, liberation.
So it's a step-by-step guide to how the soul accumulates karma, gets bound by it, and then breaks free.
Exactly. And it's interesting how each concept builds on the one before it, creating this really intricate picture of the soul's journey.
They're all connected.
Right, all interconnected pieces, ready for a little journey through time now.
Absolutely. Let's talk history. But the texts mention that writing a conventional Jain history is a bit tricky. Why is that?
Yeah, well, it's partly because of the sources. A lot of early Jain history is oral traditions.
Okay.
Myths and legends passed down through generations. If we only looked at hard facts like inscriptions or archaeology, we'd only get a very limited view. We need those stories and traditions to see the whole picture.
Like piecing together a mosaic rather than just looking at a single tile?
Exactly.
Are there any events from Jain history that really illustrate how the tradition evolved?
Well, there's an inscription about King Kharavela of Kalinga, who ruled in eastern India around the 1st century BCE. He attacked Magadha and brought back a Ford maker image that had been taken from Kalinga earlier.
So there was a political side to the spread of Jainism, too, not just a peaceful spread of ideas.
It seems that way. It really shows how religious devotion and power dynamics often intertwined. That image must have been incredibly important to them. It represented more than just a religious figure, but the well-being of the whole kingdom.
Makes you wonder where that image is now and how many stories like that we just don't know about.
Right.
What else can we learn about how Jainism developed?
Jainism was really strong in southern India, especially Karnataka.
Okay.
And their impact wasn't limited to religion. They made big contributions to Tamil literature, like the Tirukkural, a collection of ethical teachings.
I love that idea. These belief systems weren't isolated. They were learning from each other.
Yeah, it's more like a vibrant exchange.
Right. Not a single static history. It challenges that whole idea.
It does. It reminds us that history is full of interwoven narratives, shared influences.
Okay, so we've talked philosophy and history. Now let's get into a core part of Jain practice, asceticism.
Right.
We know it's about nonviolence, but how does that actually work in the lives of Jain ascetics?
Jain ascetics live incredibly disciplined lives, totally dedicated to minimizing harm to all living beings.
Wow.
Not just humans, but animals, plants, even microscopic organisms, and it goes way beyond just physical actions.
So what do you mean?
It's about thoughts, words, even unintentional harm.
It's this constant awareness of their impact on everything around them.
And they have the 6 great vows,
Okay,
which are the foundation of Jain monastic life. These include nonviolence, truthfulness, non-stealing, celibacy, non-attachment to possessions, and not eating after dark.
Wait, not eating after dark. That one stands out. Why?
It's all about minimizing harm to those tiny life forms we can't see.
Oh, okay.
At night, insects come out, they're attracted to lights and food, so eating after dark increases the chances of accidentally consuming them, which goes against their vow of nonviolence.
Wow, they take nonviolence seriously.
Right.
Always thinking about the consequences, even the ones we might not think about.
Yeah.
But is it even possible to live like that? The world is full of life.
It's a huge challenge, even for the most dedicated. There's a quote from Jinapadra, a Jain scholar. He said, "If I walk, I will kill living beings. If I do not walk, the life breath within me will perish. If I eat, living beings will be destroyed. If I do not eat, then I myself will be destroyed."
That's powerful. It acknowledges that just by existing, we cause harm.
Right. It's unavoidable.
So how do they reconcile that with their commitment to nonviolence?
It comes down to minimizing harm whenever possible, acting intentionally and cultivating deep compassion. They know that some violence is just inherent in the world, but they're trying to make choices that align with their values.
It's a good reminder that perfection isn't always possible, but we can still strive for it.
Absolutely.
We've been focusing on the ascetics, but what about everyday Jains, the lay people?
Yeah.
What are their lives like?
Lay people are crucial to Jainism.
Okay.
They support the ascetic community and work towards their own spiritual growth.
How do they do that?
Practices like fasting, meditation, giving to charity, and pilgrimage.
Okay.
It's a whole way of life.
But do they live as strictly as the monks and nuns? Are they held to the same standards?
It's complicated.
Yeah.
The scriptures describe an ideal lay path, but the reality is, medieval and modern Jain life is more nuanced.
Right.
There's this tension between the ascetic ideal and how lay people actually practice.
In what way?
For example, ascetics saw a lot of lay activities as inherently violent. Even things like donating to temples or performing rituals.
So even their devotion could be seen as causing harm.
Yes, and it makes you think more deeply about how interconnected everything is.
Yeah.
The ripple effects of our actions.
Absolutely. Do all lay people feel burdened by this?
Not all. Many find meaning in navigating these complexities and trying to live ethically in their everyday lives.
It's about finding that balance, right?
It is.
Speaking of balance, let's talk about Jain rituals and devotion.
Okay.
What are some of the key practices that connect Jains to their faith?
Pilgrimage is huge for both sects. It's a way to connect with history, venerate the Ford makers, and deepen their spiritual practice.
Yeah.
Mount Satrunjai is a major pilgrimage site for Svetambars.
Okay.
And Digambars often go to Shravanda Bigua.
I bet those journeys are filled with devotion and introspection.
Absolutely.
What other rituals do they practice?
For lay people, a central one is Dravya Puja,
Okay.
which involves making these really elaborate offerings to the Ford maker images in temples.
Like what kinds of offerings?
They offer water, sandalwood paste, flowers, incense, light, rice, sweets, fruit.
Wow, that's intricate. I'm curious about the symbolism behind each offering. What do they all represent?
Each element has multiple layers of meaning.
Yeah.
The water is purity, sandalwood is tranquility, flowers are spiritual awakening, incense is the burning away of karma, and the light signifies enlightenment.
It's like a microcosm of the whole spiritual journey, all in those offerings.
It is.
I also read that Jains worship goddesses. That surprised me a bit.
They do. The Ford makers are the central figures of veneration. But Jainism also includes goddesses, like Sarasvati, the goddess of knowledge.
Okay.
And it's interesting, the oldest known image of Sarasvati is actually Jain.
Oh, wow.
And she's shown holding a sacred book.
So even within a religion that focuses on renunciation,
Mm-hmm.
there's still room for devotion to deities.
There is.
Before we move on to modern Jainism, I think we have to talk about Anekantavada, one of the most fascinating and maybe even radical ideas in Jain thought.
Absolutely. Anekantavada, which means many-pointedness.
Okay.
It's about acknowledging that multiple perspectives can be valid. It comes from the belief that reality is so complex that no single viewpoint can capture it all.
That's such a refreshing idea, especially these days when everything feels so polarized.
It is.
So why do Jains believe in Anekantavada?
It comes from two core beliefs.
Okay.
First, the belief that Ford makers were omniscient. They could see every angle of reality.
Wow.
And second, that reality is both permanent and constantly changing. This makes it so complex you can't just have one interpretation.
So it's about recognizing the limits of our individual viewpoints.
Yeah.
And being open to the idea that truth can be found in many places.
Exactly. And that's a powerful concept.
It is.
Especially today.
How does this acceptance of different viewpoints influence how Jains interact with other religions?
There's a great quote from Haribhadra, the Jain scholar we talked about earlier. He was known for his inclusive views.
Right.
He said, "I do not have any partiality for Mahavira, nor do I revile people such as Kapila, the founder of the Hindu Samkhya system. One should instead have confidence in the person whose statements are in accord with reason."
That really shows the Jain approach to interfaith dialogue.
Doesn't it?
It's not about dogma, it's about finding common ground through reason.
Precisely. And that openness is a hallmark of Jainism.
I like that.
It encourages us to question assumptions, to see the world through multiple lenses.
That's something we could all benefit from.
For sure.
Okay, let's shift gears to modern Jainism. How is this ancient tradition adapting in today's world? How are those timeless principles being interpreted and practiced today?
Well, it's fascinating. Like in any living tradition, it's not static. There have been periods of reform and renewal throughout Jain history, like the Terapanthi sect. They emerged in the 18th century.
Okay.
The founder, Biko, he was a Svetambara monk.
Right.
And he was really troubled by what he saw as corruption and division in the Jain community at the time.
So he was trying to bring back a sense of unity, purify the practice.
Yeah, that's a theme we see in a lot of religious reforms.
Right.
Biko wanted to get rid of what he saw as unnecessary elements and go back to the core principles, stricter interpretation.
Okay, so what did that look like?
The Terathi sect are known for really adhering to that monastic code.
It's okay.
And they also have this unique leadership structure.
Their leadership structure, what's unique about it?
They have a single leader, the Acharya.
Okay.
And he has absolute authority over the whole sect.
Wow, so one person instead of many voices. That's a big change from those more decentralized structures.
It is, but it really emphasizes unity and discipline.
Right.
And it's been effective for them.
Okay. Any other notable modern Jain movements?
The Kanji Swamapanth, a modern Digambara tradition.
Okay.
They emphasize Kunda Kunda's teachings. He was a really influential Jain philosopher, probably lived sometime between the 1st and 5th centuries CE.
Got it.
They advocate a return to what they consider pure Jainism, stripping away rituals and traditions they see as obscuring the core teachings.
Kind of a back-to-basics approach.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting, Kanji Swama, who was key to this movement, he actually claimed to have received direct knowledge from Kunda Kunda in a past life.
Wow, a past life connection. That ties right into the Jain belief in reincarnation, doesn't it?
It does. And he used this claim to kind of legitimize his authority, even though he didn't come from a traditional Digambara lineage.
It was a clever way to connect his movement to that ancient wisdom and bypass the existing hierarchies.
Yeah, really smart.
So as we wrap up this Jainism deep dive, what are the key takeaways you hope people will remember?
I think the biggest thing to remember is that Jainism isn't just a set of doctrines or historical facts.
Right.
It's a living, breathing tradition full of nuance and complexity. It's always evolving.
Yeah.
And it challenges us to think deeply about reality, about how we're all connected, and about the ethical implications of everything we do, even the small things.
This has been really eye-opening for me.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is. I have a much deeper appreciation for Jain thought now.
Me too.
It's a really rich perspective that I think can enrich our understanding of the world and who we are.
Absolutely. There's a timeless wisdom there, I think, that goes beyond any culture or time period.
I agree. Before we go, I want to leave everyone with a final thought to ponder. We talked about Anekantavada, that Jain principle of recognizing multiple viewpoints. What if we all try to apply that in our own lives? How would embracing many-pointedness change how we see the world, interact with others, even approach our own beliefs? It's a question worth thinking about. I encourage you to keep exploring Jainism. There's so much more to learn and discover. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.